is with me, and so is Cole Harrison. Hania is with Roots Action and Progressive Democrats of America, Middle East Alliances. Cole Harrison is the executive director of Massachusetts Peace Action. Maha Khan is navigating the tech for us. Thank you, Maha. And we have a packed agenda tonight. We're going to be looking at some updates on Ukraine, on Cuba, possibly, if Medea can join us from her book tour. Cole, I believe, is going to talk to us about the Middle East, and Hania will talk to us about Iran. And Wei Yu, who is our coordinator of China is Not Our Enemy campaign with CODEPINK, is going to deliver some upbeat news. We need all that tonight as well. And then we'll hear from our featured guests, Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies, Scott Horton of antiwar.com, the editor, and Erik Sperling of Just Foreign Policy. So we're going to be looking at the midterms, what opportunities are in front of us that we might take advantage of, and what's going on in the world right now. We also have a couple of actions that we ask that you stay with us to take. And one is to say to our Congress members, please do not approve another $22 billion for weapons to escalate the war in Ukraine. We'll be calling them, and we'll also be emailing them, but we'll make it easy. Okay, so with that, let's go to Hania for an update. What's going on, Hania?
Yeah, before we begin, though, I do want to urge everyone to please introduce yourselves in the chat so we know where you're logging in from. Again, it's always a delight to have you. But yeah, I am more than happy, Marcy, to talk briefly about what's happening in Iran with regards to the uprising. Unfortunately, as a result of Iran's crackdown on protesters since the uprising and the sale of drones to Russia, the United States' focus has shifted significantly away from reviving the nuclear deal, otherwise known as the JCPOA, which Tehran has so far rejected also. In speaking to reporters in Paris, Iran's special envoy, Robert Malley, insisted that the United States would leave the doors open to resume diplomacy when and if the time came, but for now, Washington would continue a policy of sanctions and pressures. Malley mentioned that if the negotiations are not happening at the current moment, it's really because of Iran's current position and what has been happening since the month of September with the crackdowns. He says, and I quote, our focus is not an accord that isn't moving forward, but what is happening in Iran, this popular movement and the brutal crackdown of the regime against protesters. And it is the sale of armed drones by Iran to Russia and the liberation of our hostages. And when he's talking about the hostages, he's referring to the 3 American nationals who happen to be held in Iran. Businessmen Siamak Namazi, Emad Sharqi, as well as the environmentalist Morad Tahbaz. Since Iran pulled out of the deal, Iran has continued its nuclear program, installing hundreds of more advanced centrifuges, machines that enrich uranium, increasing the country's ability to enrich well beyond the limits that was set in 2015 under the nuclear deal. Iran began breaching those terms in 2019 in response to the US withdrawing of the JCPOA by President Donald Trump. So we have to see what happens. Yeah.
Thank you for that update, Hania. All right, Cole, you have an update for us as well.
Well, I'm not going to say much about the Middle East when we have Phyllis on deck as a speaker, so I'll just say that the Yemen War Powers Resolution still is out there. We have some false moves to deal with. There's the administration anger at Saudi Arabia for reducing its oil production, but we really need to focus on ending the Yemen war. That's really our issue with Saudi Arabia. That has to be in the foreground. And of course, in Israel-Palestine, with the new right-wing government coming in Israel, the settler violence unchecked, and U.S. impunity, the administration, the Congress, the country has some major decisions to make about whether it's going to do anything at all about the inclusion of open fascists in the Israeli government. I'll just leave it there.
Yes. Thank you, Cole, for that update. And now I want to turn to Wei Yu, who's the coordinator of our CODEPINK's China is Not Our Enemy campaign. What is the promising news tonight?
Yeah, so on Monday, President Biden and Xi Jinping met during the G20 summit in Indonesia. They've met previously when Biden was vice president to Obama, and this is the first time that they met as heads of state. This is a huge victory for diplomacy, and this is a huge victory for peacemakers everywhere. Important dialogues between Beijing and Washington had stopped since House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August. This was a huge provocation for China because it altered the diplomatic status of Taiwan and also challenged the One China policy, which is the red line for China. And after this slapped in the face, Beijing halted important dialogues such as climate change and poverty. And even leading up to the meeting on Monday, Politico ran a story a couple of weeks ago about how Chinese officials were showing reluctance to move forward with the meeting. Their attitude was, you keep shutting us down and refuse to show good faith, so why should we bother talking to you at a negotiation table? And that's really a big stark contrast for how the mainstream media depicts China. They often paint China as they're just looking to cause trouble or show aggression, but really they just want their voice to be heard and want their red lines respected. And isn't that just the most human thing? And now the mainstream media were caught by surprise that the meeting went so successful. We've all seen the headline, President Biden saying there need not be a new Cold War. And he does not think there is any imminent attempt on the part of China to invade Taiwan. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is also said to visit China soon, and communications between Beijing and Washington is back. So during the meeting, Xi Jinping said this quote, humanity are confronted with unprecedented challenges. The world has come to a crossroad. Where to go from here? This is a question that is not only on our mind, but also on the mind of all countries. And I think that's really just the message of our campaign. China is not our enemy. Our enemy is climate change. Our enemy is poverty. And when diplomacy fails, the world suffers. But when diplomacy succeeds, we can cooperate and tackle all of these great challenges that we face as humanity. So if you would like to stay updated with our campaign, I'm going to drop some information in the chat really quickly. But yeah, some good news for tonight.
Thank you. And we need that good news. Thank you so much, Wei Yu, the coordinator of our China is Not Our Enemy campaign. Medea had hoped to join us tonight, but she, as many of you know, is on a busy national book tour, international as well. She's in Canada tonight, promoting the book that she wrote with Nicholas J.S. Davies, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. She wanted to talk to us about opportunities, post-midterm opportunities to press the Biden administration to take Cuba off the state sponsor of terror list. She thinks that, well, she's been in meetings with people in the State Department, and now that the Democrats can give up on Florida ever becoming blue, or at least in the next 4 years, it looks like, the Republicans swept Florida. So she's hoping that President Biden will no longer be listening to a relatively small group of people who want to continue the embargo and this state sponsor of terror list. She might have also addressed what happened in Brazil. Good news there with the election of Lula, defeating Bolsonaro, who really wanted to savage the rainforest, a carbon sink we all need. And President Biden, the next day after Lula's election, he congratulated him. And I was just reading today how officials within the Biden administration had basically told Bolsonaro, you better not pull a Trump on us and claim that the election was rigged. You will never get help from us. But I think with Biden's framing the world as a struggle between democracy and autocracy, he very much saw Bolsonaro as representing a Trumpian faction. So that's, I think, what Medea was going to address with us. I think it's time to get into our program. I'm looking forward to our speakers. And while we're listening, Maha's going to post a couple of things in the chat. on her book tour, Medea plays a terrific video. It's 18 minutes that she produced with Michelle Elner at CODEPINK, and then people debrief it. You can also have a living room discussion watching this video. It's on YouTube, and I'm going to ask you tonight, please, everyone on the call, just to like the video so we can boost its visibility. All right, thank you very much. Okay, our first guest will be introduced by Cole Harrison.
Sorry, you caught me off guard with that one, Marcy.
All right, so Phyllis
Very
Bennis.
introducing.
Okay. Phyllis Bennis is the director of the new Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on the Middle East, U.S. wars, and issues at the United Nations. Phyllis will update us on the effects of the U.S. elections on Israel, including an update on the Israeli elections, the possible impact of a Republican-controlled House on the war in Ukraine, a lot to update us there, with missiles flying in Ukraine, and the impact of European protests to demand diplomacy, not sanctions. Also, calls from the chair of the Joint Chief of Staff. So, Phyllis, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Marcy. Thanks, Cole. Thanks to CODEPINK and Mass Peace Action and all of you for being with us tonight. There are, as Marcy just said, some fascinating developments today in Ukraine, good, bad, and weird. The good news, not just today, but the last several days, is that we've been hearing some significant shifts in the discourse coming out of the Pentagon and the White House and everywhere in Washington about the need for a diplomatic track. We're not hearing the possibility of cutting back on the military track in Ukraine in terms of the billions of dollars that have been sent already. And now there's talk of a $37 billion new request coming from the White House to Congress. But there are hints and a little bit of uncertainty, but not dismissing out of hand the idea that we do need a diplomatic track here if there's any hope of finding an endgame to this horrific war in Ukraine. We're not hearing much of that in Congress, which I'll get to in a few minutes, but we are hearing it from other powerful voices, from the Pentagon, from the White House. And that, I think, is very good. It means that, among other things, the kind of dismissive attitude and really attacks on the letter sent by the Congressional Progressive Caucus a couple of weeks ago that, as you all know, was ultimately withdrawn within the first 24 hours after it was dropped. That's a good sign that it's no longer being considered political suicide to talk about the need for a diplomatic track. The bad part is today there was a massive escalation of Russian rockets across Ukraine in a number of cities, again, not seeming to involve Russian troops, but long-range missiles that are wreaking incredible havoc on a number of cities, particularly aiming at and hitting power grids of various sorts. So the prospects of a very cold winter seems to be looming. And then by the end of today, we saw that there were explosions, what looked to be two missiles, maybe, that may have been Russian missiles that landed in Poland. None of that has been confirmed yet. And it's significant, I think, that neither the Ukrainian nor the US nor NATO officials are rushing to claim that, yes, we know this was Russian missiles, and we know that it was deliberate. They're being very careful to say, we don't know that it was Russian missiles. If it turns out to have been Russian missiles, we have no evidence yet that it was deliberate as opposed to a misfiring of some other missiles. So that part, I think, is all very important. The discussions of the NATO obligations, there are some rather bellicose calls coming from some of the Eastern European countries. The Baltics and Lithuania were more active in calling for immediate NATO with engagement, but even there, they're calling for discussions based on Article 4 of the NATO Charter, which calls for consultations. They did not call for a meeting based on Article 5, which allows, although it doesn't only allow military support, military protection, but that's included within Article 5. They were not calling for that. So that's significant. So that's sort of the bad news of the day, is that escalation, both in Russian missiles across Ukraine and this now questionable issue of the explosions in Poland. And then the weird thing that happened, which is kind of good, but quite strange. Some of you will know that yesterday, Friday, that wasn't yesterday, that was last Friday. there was a vote in the United Nations calling for support for a request from the General Assembly of the UN to the International Court of Justice, asking for an advisory opinion on the legality or illegality of what they are identifying as the prolonged occupation of Palestinian land, meaning the occupied Palestinian territories, including occupied East Jerusalem. And the yes votes, there were 98 countries who voted yes. Most of NATO voted no with the US and the Brits. But of the countries who voted yes, included Ukraine, which was an interesting notion of recognition perhaps on the Ukrainian side of realizing what occupation really looks like and what needs to be done to end it. But given the dependence of Ukraine for US and NATO military support, as well as economic support, it was an interesting expression of independence for them to vote to support the resolution when the US was leading the opposition against it. So good, bad, and ugly to sort of introduce this. The question of the broader issue on Ukraine, we do need an immediate ceasefire that is not based on the balance of forces on any particular day. A ceasefire is not the same thing as the long-term negotiations that will be required. Today, there was a release by Zelensky, President Zelensky, of a 10-point proposal for peace. It's quite vague, it's quite broad. It was released at the G20 meeting in Bali, but it's significant for a number of reasons. One, that it's reference to the withdrawal of Russian troops and cessation of hostilities, meaning a ceasefire, did not specify from where. So whether they're talking about a complete withdrawal from all of the areas controlled by Russia, or only the territory that has been seized by Russia since the war began in February of this year, very unclear. A lot of other things that are quite vague, but the fact that he released a set of requirements, none of which seem to challenge any of Russia's red lines. That was, I think, a significant move forward. So there are some opportunities here. I think we're looking at an opportunity to press Congress much harder right now around the need for a diplomatic track. The Biden position expressed in the last couple of days, as well as that coming from the Pentagon, from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and from the Defense Secretary, all pretty much parallel that letter that was issued by the Congressional Progressive Caucus that was seen as so outside the pale, right? And suddenly that's kind of the legitimate position that's under discussion in all of these Washington arenas. There are both military and political reasons why they may be shifting their position. The economic reasons, the $65 billion that we've spent already on Ukraine, Biden just asking for an additional $37 billion. The military reasons, clearly that the notion that Ukraine is going to be able to win some all-sided victory in this war has been pretty much debunked. And I think that this is the moment when we can really be very effective in winning some congressional support for a stronger call, not the kind of tentative reaching out and touching that we're seeing now, but a stronger call saying that we must have a call for an immediate ceasefire and a commitment to whatever diplomacy it takes to bring this war to a halt. Now, I know I'm going a bit long. I wanted to just touch briefly on Israel-Palestine. I'm glad that Cole covered some of the quick issues around Saudi Arabia and Yemen. In Palestine, I think most of you will know that we're in the midst of seeing a major escalation of Israeli violence and assaults on Palestinian lives, Palestinian lands. There have been more Palestinians killed this year than any year since 2005. 28 of them have been children. 800 children have been injured this year. The UN has already accused Israel just a couple of days ago of using excessive force specifically against children. So the conditions on the ground are much worse. The new government that was just elected is the furthest right-wing government Israel has ever seen. And it's important to recognize that it's not an outlier government. It's very much reflective of where public opinion is in the country. And unlike here, where you have young people being the most progressive, the least racist, the most open-minded, it's the opposite in Israel. So among Israeli Jews, the most racist, the most anti-Arab, the most Islamophobic, and the most violent are the young people. It's really tragic in terms of what it says about the future. But it does mean that this far-right government that includes the right, the far right, the extreme right, and the fascist right is very much representative of where public opinion is. There are now some real potential openings here in the US, again, in response to this. There are a number of forces within the State Department and some in Congress who are already talking about how if Itamar Ben-Gvir, the farthest right of this collection of right-wingers, is given one of the top ministries, which is quite likely he may well get the police ministry of all things, the public security ministry, that they will not talk to him, they will not engage with him, that it may turn out that it will be somewhat easier to get members of Congress and others to be willing to critique the unchallenged aid to Israel that continues despite all of this, when there's this embarrassingly overt fascist presence within the Israeli government. There's some optimism that I think we need to have. One quick thing is that the FBI today just announced that they are opening an investigation of the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, which is something that has been demanded by the Palestinian community and by the Palestinian rights movement since the day that Shireen was killed. The US has refused and refused and refused. Today, they finally acknowledge that, yes, they are going to investigate rather narrowly, only on the question of whether US arms may have been used in the attack that killed Shireen. But that's a major step forward. The Justice for Shireen Act, which now has 19 signatures, should be much easier to get more signatures on. So that's another thing where I think we have some real openings. At the international level, at the UN, there's some real motion forward on the question of not just recognizing Israeli apartheid as the appropriate framework, but looking at what do we do about that? And specifically, the question of reopening the Committee Against Apartheid. There's not only the leadership of South Africa and Namibia, but a number of countries, particularly the newly progressive governments in Latin America, in Chile, Brazil, and Colombia. There's interest from all of those governments in joining in that effort. So I think, again, public pressure there is going to be very important. And it's a new moment where, despite the really horrific conditions on the ground, there is some reason for optimism that may go forward on the international diplomatic side. And I'll stop there. We can get into more in questions. Thank you.
Here we go. Thank you so much, Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies. It's always a great pleasure to have you provide all this information and analysis on CODEPINK Congress. And we're going to be asking questions of you later on in the hour. Now I want to turn our attention to our next guest. To challenge endless war, we need a strong coalition. We need a diverse coalition. Scott Horton is the director of the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org. He's the editorial director of antiwar.com, host of Anti-War Radio for Pacifica, KPFK in Los Angeles. He's the host of the Scott Horton Show podcast on scotthorton.org. He's also the author of Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, and more. Scott will be discussing the role libertarians can play in elevating the anti-war message in the Georgia Senate runoff, as well as the next presidential race and anything else he wants to talk about. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. I hope everybody can hear me okay. And hi to my old friend, Phyllis. It's been a little while since we've spoken. I'd like to yield the balance of my time to her to go ahead and keep talking about whatever she's saying there. I miss interviewing you. We got to do this again sometime. But listen, I'm very happy to be here. And yeah, so antiwar.com is almost 27 years old now, next month. And I came in a little bit late, about 2004, but essentially the core of our mission is we're extremely anti-government, free market libertarians. And at the core of the state is the warfare state. As Mr. X explained to Jim Garrison in the movie JFK, what's all this about, man? It's the war power and who has control over the war power. So we want as little war power as possible to go along with the rest of the power that we want as to be as little as possible. So another aspect of being libertarians, of course, is that we're about 1% of the population. And I don't mean the rich. I just mean the very few who agree with each other here about this. And so on one hand, we'd like to make the whole society libertarian, but on the other hand, at least from my point of view and from antiwar.com's point of view, first things first. And I know that I can't convince people to change their entire political perspective or even their personal identity about who they are and what they are to what I want them to be instead, that would be way too much to ask. And frankly, it's not necessary. What I need from people is to just share my priorities, which really are great and smart no matter who you are. So what, at antiwar.com and at the Libertarian Institute and in my faction of the movement, our priority is always trying to oppose the very worst things the most and first. So yes, we are against the welfare state, but mostly that means we want to kick bankers off welfare. It means we want to abolish militarism and the military industrial complex. We want to separate business and state and destroy cronyism and corruption on behalf of the rich, because that is what is the worst aspect of government intervention in the economy, is doing favors for the connected at the expense of regular people. And then, of course, the warfare state is the biggest and worst and most important part of that. They never closed it down ever since World War II. And as you guys well know, the doctrine has been since the end of the Cold War, global hegemony. Even Russia and China may not be independent from the American empire in the post-Cold War era. And so that's how we got ourselves into a new Cold War right now, and one that, as you guys I'm sure recognize, is at least ratcheting up the tension. I don't know, it's making nuclear war likely, but it's raising the likelihood of nuclear war to higher than it's been since before I was born, since 1962, higher than even 1983 in the height of Reagan's brinksmanship in his first term, I think is clear. And what I want to do as a libertarian and as the leader of my own institute and at antiwar.com is I want to try to forge coalitions around the most important issues. And so, for example, for 20 years, we've been running Phyllis Bennis and Pat Buchanan right next to each other, as long as they're making a solid point, right? And we featured Nicholas Davies and Medea Benjamin, tens and tens of times, if not hundreds. We've been featuring Davies for years. And so we're extremely, the fact that we're libertarian almost has nothing to do with, if you read antiwar.com, you don't really know who we are. We just try to feature the best anti-war stuff from all over the place that we can find. And we have very high standards too. You don't find kooky stuff. It's all very good stuff. But we're trying to build essentially and set an example of building a coalition that is only ideological in the barest sense that, you favor human decency and you understand that this is not the natural course of events. It does not have to be this way at all. We've allowed certain people to make these choices to make it this way, and it can be undone. So now this brings us to the problem of our current partisan politics, right? Is you have typically what happens is whoever's in power, the group of people, the citizens who represent the other party, the party that lost, get mad at the government, right? So like in the 1990s, the right wing was anti-government because Bill Clinton was in there. And then when George W. Bush was in there, it's not that progressives completely gave up on the idea of the welfare state and the regulatory state, but they certainly were totally against the regime and the torture state and the unitary executive and all the lies and all the torture and all the war and everything that the Bush regime, represented at that time. And then, of course, the right wing loved it, but then they switched. When Obama came, they became all very anti-government again. But then we had this funny wrinkle in time where Donald Trump came and the government hated him even more than progressives hated him. And the CIA and the FBI counterintelligence division framed him for treason with Russia, which no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, that just was not true. But they were acting essentially as antibodies, trying to protect the state itself from its new elected leader. And liberals and progressives, by and large, sided with the CIA and the FBI and the national security state, because anyone to protect us from that goon, Donald Trump. And I'm not defending Donald Trump from anyone's perception of him here. I'm completely against the guy who wrote a whole book condemning him for genocide in Yemen and the rest. So he's just as guilty as the rest of them. Don't anyone get me, misunderstood there. I'm just talking about the effect that he had on the left, because he made the left and progressives identify so closely, even with the worst parts of the state, as long as they were standing against him, as we've seen with the rehabilitation of George W. Bush, for example, by mainstream liberals. that guy from the Media Matters the other day. I praised him in like honest good faith for condemning W. Bush and saying, oh, looks terrible that Bush and Obama are condemning misinformation together, because of course he would never condemn Obama, but he said George Bush just lies so much. And I said, hey, good for you for not backpedaling on Bush just because Bush is anti-Trump, as so many people are on the left are doing these days. So we've seen then, like, where we should have a robust anti-war left, at least in the House of Representatives, there should be, I don't know, 15 or 20 people who give a damn. And instead we got 4, and then they all roll over and back down on a moment's notice as soon as the Twitter swarm comes for them for saying that we should negotiate. When we have a hot proxy war right on Russia's border, and the fate of all of humanity hangs in the balance. But peer pressure and social psychology says that, in fact, I forgot the quote, was from a congresswoman, a Democratic Party congresswoman recently was overheard saying, oh, but how would it look if we proposed negotiations? Well, it would make you look like a hero, right? But in their social circles, that will mean that they're radicals, that maybe they're leftists, that they're anti-American, that they love Russia and hate Ukraine or whatever. They're terrified of the perception if they fight for peace. So that means a couple of things. It means, first of all, that the anti-war left and real principled progressives who care a lot more about the issues than they care about the Democratic Party, you guys have a huge road to hoe in terms of mercilessly pressuring liberal Democrats from the left and explaining to them how it is that you just absolutely will not stand for them taking the George W. Bush, John McCain line on Eastern Europe or on Yemen or whatever it is. We're the Democrats. It's the only thing people like about us is we're less worse on war. That should be y'all's narrative on pressuring the left. And then that means that me and the libertarians and the few paleo conservatives and other non-interventionist right-wingers, and we have this huge challenge to try to really, educate and inculcate and corral the America First MAGA conservatives, or to the right of the conservatives, if you want to call them that, to the poorer than the conservatives, a lower social class than the conservatives. If the conservatives, it's all the country club guys. These are the guys that work for them, and they should be completely anti-war. And MAGA and America First should not mean we want to leave Russia alone so we can pick on China instead, or we want to leave Yemen alone so we can pick on Iran instead, or something like that. But of course, as you guys, I'm sure, all recognize, the Republican Party as it exists today is still George W. Bush's party. It is Mitch McConnell and John McCain and Lindsey Graham's Republican Party. And, they are to the right of Joe Biden in the worst way on Ukraine, for example, right now. Here's your appropriation bill. You better sign it. And it's more than you asked for. And all of that kind of thing is Mitch McConnell's take. So there needs to be, and I'm open to ideas, because this is, I think, the most important project in America right now, frankly, is forcing a civil war on the right between the people who say that they're America First and actually mean it. And there are a few people like Thomas Massey, he's probably the very best of them. But even that Margaret Taylor Greene, no matter what else you think of her on any other issue, her attitude on Ukraine is, why are we wasting this money? Why are we being reckless and intervening in a fight where we don't belong, and all these things, which is, of course, exactly right. And, you guys might remember in Syria in 2013, after the first big fake sarin attack. Well, it was real sarin, but it wasn't Assad that did it. And Obama almost got us into a war. And one of the things that stopped that at that time was Breitbart.com. And it was at that time still under the control of Bannon. And Bannon put out on Breitbart that we don't want to do this war. And frankly, the narrative was that the gas attack is real, I guess, but we don't care enough about the people of Syria to go and save them. Screw them. And it was a pretty cynical take. It was a pretty ugly take. But what it amounted to was marching orders to every talk radio AM host in America. It was marching orders to every Republican member of the House in America that we absolutely do not want to do this. And they were unanimous against it. The Republicans were completely against it. And there were, the House of Commons gave Obama an out, and James Clapper gave him an out, and he backed out, thank God. But the anti-war sentiment on the right, the idea that we're not going to follow Barack Obama into battle. We're not going to take the side of a bunch of Al-Qaeda terrorists against a tyrant in a three-piece suit. Forget it. Which was essentially the right take. That take prevailed. And it's not perfect. It's not progressive. It's not bleeding heart and heartfelt. And it's not exactly what you guys want. But the thing is about it is we can't, just like I can't make everybody a libertarian, you guys can't make the 99% into leftists. They're not, you know? And so, I mean, you can't even make the liberals into leftists, right? So that means that we got a whole other right half of America that we got to get good on this. And what it all comes down to is social psychology, right? This is what Ron Paul did. Ron Paul said, I'm a humble old Texas conservative Republican congressman. And I say, you don't have to believe in this crap. It's a bunch of crap. And people were like, what, really? By the millions and millions and millions. It wasn't enough to make him president, but it set millions of people free, tens of millions of people free from feeling like they absolutely had to believe in whatever George Bush was doing, or else that meant they were a leftist and they weren't willing to be that, right? And then Donald Trump did it even more. He had to, because he had to smash Jeb Bush. And so in typical Trumpian fashion, Trump said, going to the Middle East was the worst decision any American president ever made on any issue ever. How do you like that? And then he said to the American right, isn't that right? And they said, if you say so, Donald, and followed him. And they forsook Bush. And remember, McCain and Romney wouldn't dare, and they lost. Donald Trump got up there, went full jihad against George Bush, and his legacy broke from it and won. And so that made a major change in the minds of people on the right. And so it's something that all of us have to figure out how to exploit in the best ways that we can. And there are, even when you're dealing with your liberal representatives, that you can say, look, we can't be to the right of Rand Paul on this. We can't be to the right of Mike Lee on this. We got a handful of America Firsters who want to back down, and we're going to be worse hawks than them, right? So we're providing some talking points for y'all, for your own, and some perception points for you guys in order to fight your best fight. That, look, we can't let these Republicans make a mockery out of us when we got, and look, let's be real. Look at the Yemen resolutions. It's almost entirely Democrats who signed on to that thing. There's 5 Republicans who signed on to the House version so far, none in the Senate. So don't get me wrong, what I'm saying here, that like the Republicans are better now or whatever. I'm just saying that this is what we have to work with. And we desperately need 51 votes, right? We desperately need caucuses of different factions of people up there who will refuse to appropriate money for these things. And so, look for your allies where you can get them. Pat Buchanan, yeah, I'm sure that you guys really don't like his take on a lot of things, but you know what? I bet you'd really like his take on a lot of things too, and be surprised how good he is on China, and be surprised how much mileage you could get with your right-wing brother-in-law by showing him a good Pat Buchanan article you printed out from antiwar.com. That, look, Pat was Nixon and Reagan's guy, and he's still for the old Cold War. He doesn't even take back support in Vietnam. But he's saying right now, never mind Russia, he's saying we don't need to pick a fight with Red China. Big red flag with its yellow star and everything. And Pat Buchanan says, come on, Nixon made peace with them 50 years ago. We can get along with them. If Nixon can make peace with Mao, then we can get along with Xi, says Pat Buchanan, right? So now I know that that's what Phyllis Bennis thinks too, and I'll cite Phyllis Bennis all day. But I'm just saying sometimes you got to cite Pat because it depends on who you're talking to, So I'll be quiet now, but I guess that's the challenge for us, right? Is keeping in mind these partisan politics and what we can do to manipulate these people. Oh, and I guess I'll say one last thing is, me and my faction took over the Libertarian Party last May, and it was always run by a bunch of blue pill dunderheads who want a flat tax or some crap that nobody cares about, right? But now it's me and my guys that run the thing. And so the first thing we did was sign on to this Yemen campaign and do everything we can to corral our people. And we've had a few fits and starts. It's been a bit of a regime change, but it's not over yet, right? And now the election's over, and I actually know a guy who knows Mike Lee's son. And I've met Mike Lee before, so I'm going to try to get on the phone with the senator and see if I can get him to take the lead on this. And I already know
from talking with Hassan al-Tayyeb that if Mike Lee will lead in the Senate on the right, then there's about 4 or 5 more who will come with him. But he's got to go first because they're a bunch of cowards. So even Rand Paul, can you believe that? Ron Paul's son. But anyway,
All right.
Thank
So-
you, Scott.
Well, Scott, we're going to get back to you when we
Sure,
do our
go ahead.
Q&A. You've given us a lot to think about in terms of building coalitions and pressuring those who purport to be progressive to say, stop all the war funding. And you're very entertaining. Thank you. Next, we have Erik Sperling and Hania Jodat of Roots Action and Middle East Alliances with Progressive Democrats of America. We'll do the introduction.
Thank you, Marcy, and thank you, Scott. My goodness, host of Anti-War Radio for Pacifica 90.7 FM. Honor and a privilege to introduce our next guest, Erik Sperling, who is the Executive Director of Just Foreign Policy. Earlier in his career, Erik worked as a senior advisor and counsel to the offices of Congressman Ro Khanna and Congressman John Conyers. He has a Juris Doctor from Georgetown University Law Center. And Erik will talk about the impact of midterms, the geopolitics in the Middle East foreign policy with a laser focus on Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So take it away, please, Erik.
Yeah, thank you so much. And good evening, everybody. This is an incredibly difficult speakers to follow. So I'm gonna have to take issue with the booking on this, but I'm gonna do my best. I really, a lot of what Scott is going over is kind of overlaps with some of the same work. Scott's been one of our really fantastic kind of, right-leaning voices on Yemen. And I thought we would, talk a little bit about Yemen and Saudi policy. I think, we're still waiting to see how this election is going to fully play out. Part of it is because of the very thin majority, the thin majorities on both sides. I think, there wasn't exactly the, in some ways, the pro-Trump wave that was expected. The kind of Trumpian wave was something that some folks thought would work to, peace activists' advantage on certain issues like Ukraine. That wasn't necessarily the case with Saudi Arabia. And so I think we're kind of getting a sense for how this is going to play out and where some of these Republican members are going to land on some of our key issues. From our perspective, and as Scott mentioned, the number one issue, one of the most important issues in the world would be the Yemen, is the conflict in Yemen that's been going on for over 7.5 years. I've been, we've been working on that both as a staffer, starting back in April 2015, and made a lot of progress. I see lots of activists on this list who've made huge contributions to that over the years and recently. Little by little, we've been able to limit U.S. support for that Saudi-led coalition. Unfortunately, it was Tony Blinken who was in. Tony Blinken was actually in. He was actually in Riyadh to announce back in April 2015, full U.S. support in terms of weapons transfers and intelligence. But little by little, we've been able to chip away at that using different congressional maneuvers. And the U.S. Biden actually, when he came in, announced that there would be very limited, that they would limit U.S. support to only defensive support, not offensive support. But unfortunately, that quota has not been clearly defined, and the support that the U.S. is giving is enough to allow the Saudis to remain in Yemen, continue their bombing campaign, and continue a blockade that essentially prevents Yemen from conducting normal economic activity, and is probably the main factor in why Yemenis have up to about 20 million people who are dependent on aid and who are facing hunger. So, some of you may have heard, there's been an effort that Scott mentioned as well, called the War Powers Resolution. We passed a version of it through the House and Senate under Trump, who vetoed it. And we have a new version that would end all U.S. support for that Saudi coalition. And we're hoping that we have over 120 co-sponsors in the House and Senate on that already, including about like a dozen Republicans so far. And, given that that Saudi Arabia made this decision that was perceived as being helpful to Russia by raising, cutting the OPEC production and which is perceived as being an intent to help Republicans win and Democrats lose. There is a lot of sentiment. There's been a lot of statements from even more pro-Saudi or hawkish members against the Saudis. So the big task now coming out of this election is to force that vote in the Senate, and then pass it in the Senate and pass it in the House and send it to President Biden's desk for signature. So, you could actually, CODEPINK will have the resources, but, we have such a great group of activists on this call. You can look and make sure, see if your member of Congress or senator is on, and that would be an incredibly, that would be an incredibly useful thing to do. That could, because by ending the Saudi ability to bomb Yemen and to blockade Yemen, Yemen's economy could actually recover, and they could actually work out their political issues among the Yemeni people without Saudi influence and U.S. influence. So I just wanted to say that that's our main priority, in terms of Yemen, and kind of the role of the Saudis. But then more broadly, I thought, so we don't have Medea, right? So I could do a quick, brief Latin America review, could be helpful. I think in general, it's also a really interesting time. I think one thing I would say is a congressional staffer, former congressional staffer, and someone who, like Scott, we work with the left and the right whenever it's possible. Is it's a really contradictory time in many ways, and I think it's a very unpredictable time that is both obviously horrifying when it comes to the fact that we have an active proxy war on the border of a nuclear power, but then we also see now basically the administration coming out supporting the Progressive Caucus, pro-diplomacy perspective. You see, we've seen the Biden administration kind of pursue a pretty, basically adhere to many of Trump's sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela on one hand, and on the other hand, they're recognizing Lula and trying to undermine the right in Brazil. And I think then you have a whole, on one hand, we have the Progressive Caucus with a bunch of new young members. We have a 26-year-old, Cuban American left-wing progressive joining the squad. We have the squad growing, the Progressive Caucus growing on one hand. On the other hand, we have Republicans taking the majority in the House. And so I think, but of course, that Republican majority is not, we don't know how they shake out. So all that to say is, I think it's a time where we are going to see obviously committee chairs go to the Republicans. Many of them are going to be more conservative, or even more, they're not even going to pay lip service to our issues. But on the other hand, there may be opportunities to connect, with your members, your representatives in ways that were not previously possible. Maybe they're Republicans who are non-interventionists, or maybe they're Democrats who are hawkish, and if you can just win them on a little, win them over, it could make a really significant progress. Or maybe your member is a super progressive squad member, and they just need a local person to pressure them, and kind of get them engaged on foreign policy issues like CODEPINK does so well. But I think, there's some real opportunities, because we also see, and just to touch on Cuba and Venezuela sanctions policy, we're seeing a dynamic now that the Trump sanctions policy that, he largely put in after Obama had done somewhat of an opening and the economic picture was better in Cuba, has led to basically a mass migration spike from both Cuba and Venezuela that we saw most recently with DeSantis weaponizing that for political purposes. And so there's even an opening on Cuba and Venezuela policy now, where the administration is actually having to look at these hardline Trump sanctions and say, if we don't end these, we're going to have to deal with this migrant crisis that our even democratic cities are struggling to deal with. So it was just a very interesting time where I think, it's a great time for all these great activists to really connect with your member of Congress and their foreign policy staff, get to know them, whether they're on the right or left, exactly as Scott said, and try to identify, what is their interest. Because, even if maybe on 90%, whether they're a hawkish Democrat or whether they're a dovish or anti-interventionist Republican, maybe 90% you don't agree with them on, but maybe there's that 10% issue, and I think there's going to be some space for making arguments that we haven't made in the past, and potentially building coalitions we haven't built yet. So that's kind of my general take.
Thank you so much, Erik Sperling of Just Foreign Policy. And we're going to be asking Erik and the others questions in just a minute. But first, we're going to take an action. We have an email that we are sending to our members of Congress. As Phyllis mentioned, Biden has asked Congress for another, I think, $37 billion for Ukraine, about $22 billion for weapons and military training. And we are going to urge our members of Congress not to approve more of these allotments because they only escalate the war. They serve as a disincentive to an actual ceasefire and peace talks. So if you could be so kind as to post in the chat that one click, there we are. Take action. Tell Congress to vote no to escalating the war in Ukraine. So please, if you could all do me a big favor, do CODEPINK a big favor, do the world a big favor, and click on that and say enough, stop. We're spending about, what, $6 billion a month or so on Ukraine, much of it for weapons. And what do we have? What is the result? People say, oh, we got to keep funding these weapons because the Ukrainians are winning on the battlefield. They just took back Kherson, kicked the Russians out. Well, what did we see today? We saw Russian retaliation. So it's just a game of, not a game, it's a matter of escalating, and it's very frightening, as we all know. So if you could do us a big favor, please click on that link under Take Action and fill it out. We're going to go to the Q&A, and then we'll come back for another action where we actually do get on the phone and participate in what we call a Capitol Calling Party. So Maha, if you could please spotlight Phyllis and Erik and Scott. And we're also going to bring on Alan Minsky, who is one of our participants, who is the chair of Progressive Democrats of America. So Alan is going to say a few words about his thoughts on the election and opportunities for a progressive foreign policy. And I know we're putting you on the spot, Alan, but you always manage to show up.
I have a National Football League Players Association Colin Kaepernick shirt on, and I just actually want to point to that and say, in terms of foreign policy, solidarity with the workers of Qatar, and this large spectacle is going to be taking place in the Middle East, and it's all these stadiums that are going to be hosting these soccer matches were the product of what really amounts to almost near slave labor. So lifting up, international labor rights has to be central to U.S. foreign policy going forward. Then one of the things I do want to say is in the coming weeks, and I've been talking to Dennis Kucinich, of course, an old friend of PDA. If folks don't know, PDA was founded coming out of the Kucinich campaign. And Dennis and I have been talking about trying to convene a forum. Of course, we'd invite CODEPINK along, and we'd love to have Phyllis Bennis participate, of course, and maybe Scott even, but maybe Scott won't like the framing, which is that we want to talk about what a progressive foreign policy really would look like and try to get that with some clarity, because we all in PDA were very happy as the organization that drafted Bernie to run for president with the two Sanders campaigns. But even if he did strengthen his foreign policy voice more in the second campaign, it still really wasn't a central aspect of his campaign. And I think to a great extent, the Sanders campaigns, the left generally has been in the United States in recent decades a rather amorphous thing. And I do think in many respects that domestic policy, the Sanders campaigns really defined well what a progressive electoral platform would look like going forward, but not so much on foreign policy. And so we really want to, especially because there's been a lot of contestation among progressives around Ukraine and Russia, we think it's important that we try to really convene people, have dialogue going, and really, set a template and try to set a template. I mean, we don't know if we'll achieve that, for what a progressive foreign policy could be going forward. And so we look forward to everybody's participation. As for the midterm results, I have to confess that I was on, as I think I wrote to Marcy in the chat and a few other people, I was on a call for much of this with people in Georgia. And I am not the most salient person on the results. I think, I was hoping, given how insane the Republican Party was, especially coming out of the summer when the Inflation Reduction Act had passed, that the Democrats would maintain that message, with that momentum, with some very strong messaging around democracy on Roe, on calling out the Republicans on not having a policy on inflation, putting forward a positive progressive policy on domestic inflation issues, and thereby holding on to the House, getting to 52 senators, codifying Roe and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And I'm disappointed that they didn't do that. But I know it wasn't as bad as it could have been. I think in all of this, in terms of foreign policy, and again, I did miss the dialogue, it's, again, was reduced to being a very minor component of the national election and national dialogue. And we have just this incredibly hot crisis going on that is incredibly terrifying. And again, I think we need, wiser minds like those who are collected here to have a stronger voice in the national dialogue, and PDA exists to help elevate them. So thank you, everybody. I don't really have a question for anybody, but Scott, it's great to see you.
Thank you, Alan.
Scott-
It's great to see you. I'm so glad
Scott
you
and
could
I
join
were
us today.
Scott and I were at KPFK together for years. So hi, Scott.
Okay. I'm so glad that
Good to see
you
you,
could join
Alan.
us for this Q&A. So I'm going to start with the first question, then Hani will ask a question, Cole will ask a question. We'll see how much time we have left. We do have more action and we want everybody to stick around. So here's my question to you, Scott Horton, since you are with the Libertarian Party and your slate or your group took it over from what you said. That's what I got. The question is about Georgia. Okay, so the last time I checked, the Libertarian candidate is it Chase Oliver or Oliver Chase? I always get them
Chase
confused.
Oliver.
Chase Oliver. Okay, so he garnered about 81,000 votes, something like that, and Warnock beat, or he was up about 35,000 votes. So is there an opportunity in Georgia to inject Ukraine, foreign policy, China into an election that, as Alan said, has been almost devoid of discussion about foreign policy? Is there an opportunity here? And is the Libertarian Party interested in seizing this opportunity?
Yeah, well, okay, so that's a couple things. First of all, I guess he's out now. Now it's just the runoff between the top two, and so whatever opportunity there was.
He's out. I just want to clarify, but he could carry some weight.
Oh,
right?
sure. Yeah. No, look, so this is my whole extortion strategy for the Libertarian Party. And I think, the Libertarians, we are separate and different from the left and the right. But what happens is you end up having Libertarians without, with maybe some good economic understanding, but not too much vision, who just want to run against the Democrat and the Republican equally in every election. And I say that's just spitting in the wind. That what we ought to be doing is especially targeting Republican incumbents and ruining their lives, and being clearly the ones who ran essentially to the right of them and make fun of them as fake constitutionalists and rhino big spenders. And think about like Ted Cruz. He's not a real conservative, right? He's a George W. Bush kind of centrist who pretends to be a right winger. So we would attack him as a centrist pretending to be a right winger, ruin his race, and then essentially tell the Republicans, as long as you keep nominating candidates that we hate, we will keep helping the Democrats beat you. And we can say honestly, at least most of the time, that we really maybe hate the Democrat even more than you guys, but we're willing. They want to take our guns away and stuff, but we're willing to screw you guys over for them unless you do what we say. Like, for example, on one major state issue where we can really wield our margin effectively that directly impacts foreign policy is the Defend the Guard legislation. And this is legislation that's been essentially, promoted by Ron Pauley and Republicans on the state house level and state Senate level over the past few years. And it's legislation that says it would be illegal. The governor is forbidden from giving the National Guard soldiers over to the president to use in any foreign conflict unless they have an official declaration of war from the Congress, like in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, which, as we all know, they'll never do. The last time they declared war was against Romania in 1945. In 1942. This is something where we're using Madison and Jefferson's nullification and interposition against the warfare state. And we can so it's a two-pronged thing. First of all, we can extort Republican candidates. Yes, we can split the vote against you and make sure you lose unless you do what we say. And then our ransom demands are very reasonable. Pass Defend the Guard. Legalize pot, whatever, a couple of things. Legalize constitutional carry. 2 or 3 things on our most important agenda, and then
we can pull a punch and we can stay out of their way. And if we want, we could even run to the left of the Democrat next time, if that's the way it comes down. And so then that way we are, look, it's a marginal party. It only ever is going to be, what are we going to we're about to replace the Republican Party as the right side coalition party in America? No. So instead, we got to take our margin and figure out a way to wield it in a way to make Republicans hate and fear us. And they do already. Like in Texas, they just spent millions of dollars to try to keep us off the ballot. And if you guys saw on Twitter after the election, there's all of this hatred for libertarians from the right. And libertarians were saying, no, it's not our fault. And I'm saying, yes, it is our fault. That's exactly what it is. We did this to you and we'll do it to you again. And I think that this is exactly what the Green Party should be doing to the Democrats too. That when you have particularly egregious, so-called liberals, center-left, warhawk, Hillary Clintonites, that you run hard against just them, leave the Republican alone. I mean, what the hell? This is the system we're stuck in anyway. And show them that you have the power to ruin their day. And
Scott,
show them also that you have the wisdom to pull a punch against them if they do what you say.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. I ran against Jane Harman a few times.
Yeah, there you go.
The left of Jane Harman.
Good,
So absolutely, we need primary challenges. All right, Hania, next question. Thank you, Scott.
Sure.
Thank you, Scott. This question is for Phyllis, and I do want to invite for all of our guests to participate in answering this question. But with the formation of the fascist right-wing Israeli government now, do you think that the Biden administration is less likely to align with Israel in policy, or is it going to remain the same? And you mentioned something about the younger generation of Israelis now supporting this right-wing, political formation even more. What do you think is the cause of this?
Well, the second part of the question first, this isn't something new. This has been true for probably 25 years now, that the youngest cohort in Israel is the most supportive of anti-Palestinian, not just rhetoric, but actual violence and policies by the Israeli state and by the settlers. The settler youth are by far the most dangerous, most aggressive in attacking Palestinians, destroying olive trees, shooting up houses, all of those things. It's primarily the young people that are leading that. Older people are certainly following along. The reasons for it are a bit complicated. I learned something the other day that I hadn't ever known before. There's a tradition in Israel, unlike in this country and some other countries that I know of young people, teenagers, rebelling against their parents, which often takes the form of rebelling against the politics of the parents, joining a different political party, becoming a radical if your parents are right-wing, conservative Christians, for instance, all those things. In Israel, that's not a tradition among Israeli Jews. And so one effect is that the farthest right-wing parties, their children tend to grow up and embrace those same far-right ideas and actions. And because those parties, which generally are the religious nationalist right, they're the most extreme ones, they also have far more children. The average per woman in the most extreme parties is 6.2 children per woman, babies. Of the secular women, it's something like 2.3, something like that. It's 3 times as much. So those populations inside Israel are growing far faster than the secular populations that are much more likely to be on the liberal-ish side, liberal only in the context of Israel, because anywhere else it would be right-wing, whatever. But in the Israeli context, those are the liberals. The actual left in Israel, and there is a left in Israel, and they are brave and smart and incredible, and I know most of them, and they could fit in my living room. That's the real problem. It's not that they're not good, hardworking, incredibly dedicated people. It's just there's not very many of them left. They have a very hard time. And I don't believe that they are in a position to be able to have the influence that is going to transform that society from the inside. I was on a panel a day or two ago with Gideon Levy, who's a wonderful Israeli writer for Haaretz. And he said this, he said, for any of you who are waiting for the Israeli leftists to convince the population to change, it ain't gonna happen. He was like very powerful about that notion. And I tend to agree that it's really going to be a question of power from outside. which means everything from the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that will have an impact on the lives and economy and cultural access and all those things for Israelis, for Israeli Jews, and pressure from the United States government, meaning, for example, if we stopped paying what we are now paying, which is 20% of the entire military budget of Israel, it might begin to be felt a different way by Israelis. You know, there's all those factors that come into play. The first part of your question, wait, was not about the young people. What was that part? I forgot.
Biden administration.
Yeah, I think this comes back to us. Left to his own devices, I think Biden would maintain exactly the position that he has taken since the day he took office, which was, although he said as a candidate, I don't agree with what Trump has done. And he implied, and in some cases made clear, he didn't agree with anything Trump had done. Moving the embassy, recognizing the annexation of the Golan Heights, saying that settlements are legal, all of those things. He disagreed with all of them. But he has not changed them. And so they are no longer Trump's policies that he agrees with or doesn't agree with. They are now Biden's policies. After almost 2 years, it's too much already to say it's just left over. So these are his policies. The only one he has changed, and because this one only required him to say something, was, I don't think that annexation is acceptable. But formal de jure annexation doesn't yet exist. So it's kind of easy to not be, to be against that because it doesn't exist. The things that do exist, like the new embassy that's being built in Jerusalem on land stolen from private property, you'll like this one, Scott, private property owned by a Palestinian family, is the land that the new embassy is going to be built on. Biden seems fine with that. He's fine with what the statements, the really anti-Semitic statements that Trump made regarding his support for Israel, when, among other things, he told a room full of wealthy American Jewish donors to the Republican Party, he said, I was standing with your prime minister when I announced our recognition of the annexation of the Golan Heights. And not one of them in the room said, Mr. President, excuse me, we are Americans. We're not Israelis. He's not our prime minister. You're our president. God knows they would want to say that. But yeah, he's their president. They don't have a prime minister because they're not Israelis. And no one called him out for that kind of anti-Semitism. In the same meeting, he looked out in the audience and identified the two biggest donors to settlement causes inside Israel and to the Trump wing of the Democratic Party, which was Sheldon Adelson and his wife Miriam. And he talked about the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital, the undivided capital of Israel only. And he looked out and he said, Sheldon and Miriam, I did it for you. Now, if anybody wonders if he is pandering to his funders, the ultimate kind of Jewish money accusation, nobody called him on it. Jewish Voice for Peace called him on it. The left called him on it. But nobody in his circle of the Republican Party, of the Republican Jewish Coalition, I think they're called, nobody called him on it. So his combining of anti-Semitism with support for Israel remained. I don't think that Biden is going to change left to his own devices. That's why we can't leave him to his own devices. We need to significantly escalate the pressure on Biden and on Congress. This is the moment to say, we can't any longer accept this notion of providing all these weapons to Israel when they are assaulting children in Gaza by saying, well, yeah, we don't like that part. But on the other hand, Israel's a democracy. Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is our friend. Israel is our ally. We can't say that anymore.
Okay.
Do you think
Phyllis,
that Netanyahu will be harder for Biden to get along with compared to Bennett, or easier?
Let's
Because they know
hear
each other.
let's hear from
Yes,
some
I
of
think
our
it'll be
other
hard.
Oh, I'm
guests. Maybe
sorry.
Erik has a thought about that. Biden and the new Israeli government.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have anything in particular on that. I mean, to add to Phyllis is really true expert on this, but happy to talk about anything else.
All right, Cole, you have a question?
Well, my question is, I think there, in terms of tactics, we heard from several of the speakers a bunch of, things that may present opportunities in Congress. And yet, to me, we've really experienced a sea change in foreign policy with the open proxy war with Russia and with the escalating tensions against China. So I'm struggling to find a reflection of that in our politics. This is like a big change in what's been going on. We do see a bunch of Republicans that are running against the Ukraine funding, but they're probably even more hawkish on China than anybody else. I might not be completely right about all that. And then the progressive Democrats have kind of collapsed and aren't putting up any opposition. They turn tail. I mean, I don't know, they're going to come back again, because Bernie and that whole wing are like, yeah, it's democracy versus authoritarianism. We're fighting for holy, auto Christian soldiers. So I just don't know where this is going to go politically, because sure, we might have some tactical openings, but fundamentally we have a consolidation of both parties on a really aggressive foreign policy that's going to lead the world into oblivion. And where do we get a handle on this? That's
the
my
question.
question.
Is, where are the openings to challenge endless proxy wars?
If I can just jump back in on this one, I think that you're absolutely right, Cole, about the urgency of this and the intensity of it. I don't think it's easy, but I think in the last week, it got easier when we saw the reversal of positions coming from the Pentagon and the White House that essentially embraced the terms of the letter that had been drafted and distributed early by the Progressive Caucus. So that letter was a great move, and it was completely insufficient relative to what's required. But it was a crucial first step. I mean, these are members of Congress. These are not our movements. So given that, the letter was a great step forward. It was really unfortunate that they felt compelled to. I mean, the attacks were incredibly vicious and intense, and I understand why they withdrew it, but it was a terrible thing to do. I think that we now can take up that same position, point out, whether we talk about that letter or not, and it's probably not worth much at this point to be talking about it as the political pressure point, but recognizing that that is now the officially acceptable position for discourse across the line in Washington, in Congress, in the White House, in the Pentagon, in the State Department, in all of these arenas. And that means in the pages of the mainstream media, in the radio talk shows, in all of the places where we can reach people.
Yes.
And I think this gives us a new opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. And I want to follow up with a question to Erik and Ellen, if you have any thoughts on this. We want to bring all of you into this conversation. Lately, we hear from Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's a big New York Times article focused on his call for urgent, serious diplomatic efforts to resolve this war before it widens. And then people are sending me emails, is he the next to go? Is he going to be fired or replaced? Or is this part of some sort of good, what do you say? Good guy, bad guy kind of game? Or what do you think, Erik?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I totally kind of share Cole's concern. I mean, it just feels really dark with the nuclear conflicts, and then you see, the Progressive Caucus being pressured out of the letter. I will say on the upside, of course, there is this odd, part of the conservative movement that I mean, some of it is odd, some of it is, what like say Marjorie Taylor Greene, there's some sentiment there, but there's also, of course, our principled, libertarians like Scott. So there's a lot of hope there. And then, I will say you've seen people like Ro Khanna and AOC was recently quoted. She's defended the letter. And she was quoted in the New York Times defending the letter. And so, I think that sentiment, when in most of the writing on what's been done, people still believe that sentiment is there, that the letter retraction hasn't dimmed that sentiment, I think. And I think, when you look at the polling, there are tens, if not over, maybe even depending on the polling question, hundreds of millions of Americans who are taking positions that are, pro-diplomacy or pro-de-escalation on Ukraine. So there's some hope there. The other thing I would say is, this war effort does rely on this kind of sanctions approach that the U.S. has done. I mean, they started obviously with Korea or Cuba, and then they keep doing bigger and bigger countries. And now they've tried to sanction the world's biggest energy exporter. And that has been really tough and been really hard on Europe. So on one hand, while it feels like there's total unanimity, kind of everyone behind the war effort, the reality is that it's shown that it has extreme costs for the US and Europe as well. And I think there's going to be increasingly, a case to make that. And I think the White House knows this as well, that, that there's going to be economic blowback in the US and Europe if they don't wind down the economic impacts of the war. And so I think there's a lot of hope there, and that'll be time as well.
Thank you, Eric.
Marcy, if I could jump in here for
Sure.
a second, I wanted to say that I think, I saw a question. I hope I can do a twofer here. I saw a question in the chat earlier about, well, what opportunities do we have to work together with these different groups? Or in fact, the question was, how in the world can leftists work with right wingers when we disagree on so many things? And I think the answer there is, well, just call me, and me and the libertarians will serve as kind of the middlemen between the left wingers and the right wingers here. And we can do this. We're doing it right now on the Yemen resolution. So there's this left wing group called Demand Progress, which they may be here tonight. I don't know. Thank you if you are. And they're a nonpartisan progressive group, and they host this website. It's just 833 Stop War. And me and Hassan Tayeb did some work and kind of rewrote it and got it essentially where you go there. It's a very simple website. It has 4 or 5 bullet points on the Yemen war, and then it has talking points on the war, including if your congressman is a Republican or a Democrat, talk to them this way, tell them this or tell them that. And if they're good on it, then tell them this kind of thing. It's 833 Stop War if people want to look at that. And then so what we're doing is already, the Quakers and all these different left-wing groups, there's like 100 groups working together on this thing already, right? And then, but I'm, friends with some of them. So they kind of brought me in on this thing, Aisha Juman and Hassan Al-Tayeb and some others. And so then I got the Libertarian Party and Young Americans for Liberty, which is a great kind of young Republican group, but they're Ron Paulian Republicans, which means they're anti-war. And I got them, and they're like on 500 college campuses and this and that. So I'm trying to get everybody, and I'm pressuring them to kind of get this restarted in the email group there to get this thing going. So then the answer to the question is like, how do left wingers and right wingers work together when you don't like each other? The answer is just do the same thing at the same time if it's something that you agree on, right? Like we all were against bailing out Goldman Sachs. The only people who wanted to bail out Goldman Sachs are people who are billionaires and higher. And literally the 99% were against that. We can all oppose that at the same time without necessarily all hanging out together and pretending we don't disagree on other things. And so that's what we're doing with this Yemen thing is we got all these left-wing groups, and then we got these conservative and libertarian groups, taxpayer groups, and these other groups all doing the same thing on Yemen. And then I know that this is, this audience probably understands probably better than anybody that this is the worst war in the world, worse than Ukraine. Ukraine just has the potential to be the worst thing that ever happened to humanity. But the actual worst war in the world right now is the war in Yemen. That's not quite over, and that's cost hundreds of thousands of civilian lives over the last 7 years, 8 years almost, and which America is entirely responsible for. And even though it doesn't get a whole lot of press, it's when we're here, we have active, no fooling, real war powers resolutions in both houses right now. And when in the last 20 years have the people of the country had a chance to work together to essentially, demand to beat Congress over the head and demand that they pass a resolution that would make a war illegal? And it's true that Trump vetoed it last time. I think Biden would have a much harder time vetoing it. And then imagine that if we can end the year, guys, with actually getting this thing through, or at least we got it through the House. And in January, we got to work on the Senate. I don't know. And then we have this huge, that's to me, would be the hugest victory of almost the whole terror war era right there. And then we have that to build on, and we get that resolution passed, and then we spend, and I know we got to kind of do both things at the same time too, but then we can make a real effort and see that we just set the precedent of what we can do about Ukraine and what we can do about China too. We'll do another version of 833 Stop War. Click here to go to our China page. Click here to go to our Russia page. Click here to go to our Yemen page. And then we all do this stuff at the same time. And we
That
can
makes
coordinate
sense.
that. And left wingers and right wingers can coordinate it by way of calling me.
Do the
I'll
same
have it
thing
on
at
the
the same
show.
time. Thank you, Scott. We're going to end with Alan. He's got his hand up. He wants to chime in.
Shouldn't end with me because there's everybody else on the panel has thought through this a lot more than I have. I have been crunching numbers and running elections over the past 2 weeks, and a lot has happened on foreign policy. But I do think that Scott is pointing to something that I do understand from the makeup of Congress. Is Scott right? We should be able, with the Republicans who will pull in on the Yemen and the war powers resolutions, this is a very real possibility for passage in this
We
upcoming.
got more
Congress.
co-sponsors now. Last time we had 96. Now we got 116. And so we passed it with, 10 fewer at least co-sponsoring it last time around. So yes, absolutely, we could do it.
That's a great promise for this upcoming Congress. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So it is now 6:20 Pacific time, and we have one other action. So I'm going to ask everybody to please stay with us. You've been with us for the last hour and a half, almost. So please stay with us for our Capitol Calling Party. We're going to be actually calling members of Congress and saying, no more money for escalating this war in Ukraine. We don't want you to vote for this $37 billion. They need to hear from us. But first, I'm going to ask you to unmute and everybody thank our guests. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great
You
job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Very much.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you, guys.
Great discussion.
Special thanks and hi, Erik.
Okay.
Well,
All right.
Marcy,
So
we still
now
have about 117 people on the call, so let's take the action right away.
let's take the action. Yeah.
All right.
So Maha, here she has posted it in the chat. We got the phone number 202-224-3121. My name is, and I'm your constituent and zip code, whatever. And the key ask, please vote no on President Biden's latest request for an additional $37 billion for Ukraine. Most of that money will be spent on weapons, military training to escalate a war that threatens to engulf all of Europe and provoke a nuclear confrontation. We urgently need diplomacy. We need a ceasefire, not more weapons for Ukraine. So let's get on the phone, and Maha, if you're able to put that on the screen, that might be helpful too. But we can start our calls, and at some point maybe we'll hear a little music as well. I'm going to call. I'll put myself on mute.
What's the number again?
I ain't got it yet.
The number, it's right in the chat. It's 202-224-3121. And basically you're calling to speak to your member of Congress in the House. You're calling to speak to your senators and to say, we don't want
Hello, my name is Elaine Elvissery, and I am your constituent in zip code 94303. Please vote no on President Biden's latest request. Yes, yes.
Marcy, if you were saying something, you were muted.
I always forget. I was just saying, let's all mute ourselves while we make these phone calls.
So I have something for dinner. It's Tuesday. Can you get Chrissy to something for dinner? It's Tuesday. I have dinner.
Yeah, and she's coming over at 7:15 time certain. I saw, look,